So let's just begin our session today. And I do welcome everyone. Feel at home. My name's Julius Kuya from Kenya. So I'll be the one doing the moderation of today's session. I take this opportunity to welcome everyone to this 12th session. And today we are going to have our two teachers, Chris and Kelly. They take us through the collective narrative that you are able to share with them. Chris and Kelly, now is your time.
Well, thank you. It's good to see you. I wonder if you could put in your name the place where you are right now. And it'd be good just to know where your feet are on the ground right now. I'll say good morning myself. My name's Chris Corrigan. I live on this word is the Squamish word for Nuchlelachwam. It's the historic name of the island I live on, which is very near to Vancouver, off the west coast of Canada. Bowen Island is the English name. And my ancestors hail from the British Isles for the most part, from Scotland and Ireland and England, and lived here on the west coast of Canada for 26 years, just a little over half of my life. And yeah, just really happy to be with you here this morning, talking about the responses to your group reflections on our work. That's me. I'll hand it over to Kelly.
Clush akmakuash uklamachi ilumka sisha aksup mamat nakrit MT Kelly Foxcroft-Poirier. Histak shita tsumaas uhukwa omiaksu Deb Foxcroft uhukwa noaksu Mike Foxcroft uhukwita nana neksu Jan Jim Gallic Earl Foxcroft. So what I said to you in the language that I'm learning of this land is that my name, my traditional name, you'll see it beside my name, has phonetics in it, so it looks a little different. And it's Chi Islumka is my traditional name. From here, I come from a people, New Chanoth, on the west coast of Vancouver Island. It's the composition of about 14 different nations who work together politically and administratively, but have intercultural connections. The word New Chanoth means people who live all along the mountains. So we live on an island, and our territory is the whole west coast is the west coast edge of Canada here on North America. And the inner inland boundary is a spine of mountains that runs the center of the island that I live on. And I live in a little place called Tsumaas, or Port Alberni, and the anglicized river, the Somas, is the artery that runs through the entire community that brings tons of salmon, which we'll talk about probably, and cedar and swimming. So, all kinds of life is happening. And I think about the way we're shaped, each of us, by the land that we live in or the land our cultures are from, whether that's an urban landscape or a more rural space. All of those shape us, and we'll probably talk about context a bit as well. Introduction's really important in the place I come from. It's a huge component of relational practice and protocol. We always start by introducing ourselves, and by introducing ourselves as our name. But it's also understood that identity, when I say my name, it's connected to who you were. So you also say who your grandparents were. And also by your name, it's an identifier many times because they've been passed down for many generations. So through your name, they can identify a deeper lineage. And they say, oh, I know who you are because I know your grandma. Or so we are who we are in the present, but we also are who we were. And we also are in our present actions who we're going to be, because we work in the notion of being good ancestors. So whatever work we do, whatever words we say, we're very careful about them in the way that we know we're always shaping the future in every moment as well. And so I think about your work in terms of evolution, evolutionary futures, and how they're always happening in every moment in what we do. So we are who came before us, and we are who we're going to be, all in sort of these moments. And I think that relationship to time is an important part of our introductions. Also, identity is fluid. My name, this name that I live into, Chi Islumka, was given to me in 2010. And my sister and I have names that go together, which makes a lot of sense because we work together really closely. And through your life, you'll be given, through different life phases, a different name. And what that does is it demarcates different seasons of your life. So I'll get my next name officially through ceremony or through a community gathering for one of two reasons. When my last child gets married and leaves the home, I'm in a different season of my life. I'm heading into the eldership of my life. I'm no longer a mother, and I'm in a different time. My role changes. And so it demarcates that role, and they give you a name for you to live into. So my current name means pulling forward with everything she's got, giving away all of the knowledge. And in 2010, that made zero sense to me. I was like, what? What is this big idea? And the more that I do the work that I need to do in the world, the more that makes sense. It also is giving away all of the gifts. So we have a ceremony called potlatch. You are only as wealthy in the places I come from as what you can give away. The complete, not just redistribution of wealth, but giving away of wealth is essential. And so my name is like embedded in that principle as well. But I'll get another one, and I'll have some new things to live into and a new season to sink into and to learn and to stretch into. So yeah, just all of those things are in that introduction. And I have to give all of that context because all of those things would be known when I'm working here in these lands with Northwest Coast people. But I think they're all really important things for us all to consider because we have so much to learn from one another and from living at that level of depth rather than the like, hey, my name is this and this is my job, which is so typically the kind of introduction we do in workplaces. But the places I come from, we have at least an hour or so for protocol, at minimum, usually 2 hours to just be in good introduction, to just slow down and make sure we do things right with each other as human systems, but also acknowledging the metaphysics, the much bigger spiritual things that we are also a part of. Yeah, so that is my introduction, which is lengthy and important. Chew, which in my language means like, okay, I'm done.
Lengthy and important, and it's just a part of the story too. It's just a tiny little part of the story. It's like, and it points to all these things. Thank you for inviting us to be a part of this. Kelly and I had the best conversation the other day when we were talking about your reflections. We managed to pull out 5 or 6 kind of key points that I think we'll sort of touch on in a non-linear way, in a kind of storified way, things that kind of resonated and landed with us. But I just want to acknowledge we've worked together for how many years? Probably since you got your name, it feels like.
No, it was actually before then. And I've probably become a much better practitioner since I've got my name.
Right. Yeah, living into it.
Absolutely.
For a long time. And a lot of my work as a settler in these territories has been in Indigenous communities, and especially that space between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and systems and structures. And in Canada, part of the context for us answering these questions, or us talking about things that you reflecting on your reflections, has to do with the fact that we live in this space where the lands that we live on, the lands that I live on, are stolen. So there has never been a treaty, never been a war, never been a defeat of the people whose territory this is. So when I say I live in Squamish territory, it is that we all just showed up here and lived here and decided to call it our own. There is no legal basis for Canada in this part of the world. There has never been a treaty. But that hasn't stopped Indigenous peoples of these lands of being in relationship and wanting to be in relationship. And so a lot of our work is in this constant negotiation of a context as systems are evolving and changing through encounter and through connection. And so we might stumble on, make references to things that maybe we take for granted. And I'll just encourage you to Google and get more. We're not going to explain everything. It might be a little bit high context, but especially if you're coming from places like Greece and other places, you might not be familiar with the context of relationships that happens in this part of the world. But one thing I need you to know is that, especially west of the Rocky Mountains in Canada, there have been very, very few formal agreements that have acknowledged the sovereignty, or that have even talked about the sovereignty of Canada, the ability of Canada to exert laws on the land. So the place where we live is contested, right? In law, in Canadian law, it's always been contested in Indigenous. And that means that that's kind of something that draws us together. Those of us that are trying to, I would say my work has been 35 years in this space, and it's always been about living and evolving and developing that relationship together. So, Kelly, one of the first things that came out, it's kind of interesting when we think about like living into relationship. One of the first things that we reflected on was that the whole litany of questions at the beginning of the reflection about how do we know things are going to be, how do we know we're doing the right thing? How do we know we're the most optimal? And we're in this place of it's working, or we've achieved it, or this is the best thing. And of course, this is a feature of anything that's complex and evolving and ever changing. And I wanted to really quickly share with you this little cartoon that I share with people, because this is all you really need to know. You just take a screenshot of that. This kind of describes everything. This is sort of the answer to all of your questions about how do you know? It's like, well, you don't. So a lot of times when we engage in work where we're completely uncertain, we don't know where it's going to go, and we're probably going to be afraid, because in this space of intercultural work, there's all this fear. I'm going to make a mistake. Someone's going to call me a racist, especially if you're a white person. Someone's going to call me a racist. I'm going to use my power badly. And so I need to know all the different things that are going to happen before I get started. And actually, the truth of it is that you need to have an idea of what you want to do. And then you learn a lot by just getting started, and you keep learning along the way. And then you're just never going to know a bunch of stuff. So we're always going to be acting with partial knowledge of the work that we're doing and the effect that we're having. And I think that there's like a fundamental practice in systems change work that means that we're never going to know that we got there. We just keep kind of moving along. Do you know what I mean? So there's something for me. I mean, it's kind of like we were talking quite a lot about that, quite a lot about like how we disrupt the idea that if you're going to do systems change, you need to know what the plan is going to be before actually engaging. What that means and requires of us.
Yeah. What really landed for me in those questions of like, how are we going to know? Like, well, so many thoughts. So thank you for all of your good reflections and questions, because it really stirred up a lot. What I told Chris is it's like, oh my gosh, I feel like I could speak for 30 days and 30 nights rather than 30 minutes about the good possibilities and questions that all of this raises in your reflections. And the only certainty that I'm aware of is uncertainty, especially in the fact that when I look out the door and I look at living systems, when I look at trees and beaches and forests, and I mean, even a lawn, even an urban lawn, there is an ever-changing landscape at every moment. At every moment, there are new things being born and systems dying. There's that kind of dynamism at play. And so in the work that I do with community and with a lot of grassroots folks, it's always about probing the system. It's always about checking into context. And that seems like a good practice in so many ways. But the other thing that it is incredibly kind. It's incredibly kind to check in with people doing work on the ground and just fundamentally at a human level asking, how are you doing? You know, how are you? And it seems like I think we pass over these pieces in our work so much of the time because it can seem impractical or it takes up time. And I think that's the thing I'm always working against, is working with our relationship with time, slowing it down and working through the fact that just fundamentally our different cultural views of what is productive can be very different. As Chris was talking, for some reason, I wrote down a little note to myself is like the opposite of transactional is relational. If we're wanting to shift the status quo, if we're really wanting to disrupt that transactional nature, or even worse, the extractive nature of the way that we do work, we really have to take some time. We really have to take some time to be in good relationship with one another. And to start anything, that means checking like, how are all you arriving? How are we all arriving as humans? What is happening in our context? The other thing, so I'm kind of like responding to your questions, but responding to Chris's opening words about the context in which we find ourselves on stolen lands in this part of Canada, acknowledging that is, I think that so much of what we're grappling with in systems change globally comes from us speeding ahead with a number of unquestioned biases, both at an individual level, but also at a systemic and organizational level. And the reason that that came up for me is that Canada, you know, so-called Canada, and the way it's been established happened and continues to happen at a level where just notions of ownership of our relationship to the land are so fundamentally different, where the European settler notion of ownership of land just really conflicts deeply with the relationship to land of the first peoples of this land, of the difference between what's happened in the legal and court systems around rights and sovereignty, where really what it's about is responsibility and stewardship. So our relationship to the land and to each other, and even a way of working, a way of being, is not about this notion of wealth that's extractive or individualistic. It is really a deeper shift towards interconnection and interdependence. And that's a practice of working deeply in a constantly shifting unknown, but also in a constantly shifting space of humility. And I think that's part of the practice. There is a deep to transform systems, that our evolutionary futures are going to require us, we use the words about, dismantling oppressive systems, but first and foremost, we have to acknowledge our complicity in those systems, all of us. And then in order to dismantle them, be willing to let go and redistribute wealth to those who are furthest from equity. And I think that all of the parts of what I know and what I'm learning about being a mixed race person, because I'm also white. My dad is a white British settler, and I'm the beneficiary of the stolen land. Well, I'm also a person from which the land and the language and genocide has been inflicted. I'm both of those in one body. And I think traversing those identity politics for most of my life has increasingly makes all of these teachings clearly a way forward that disrupts the thinking, disrupts our usual thinking about what it is we might be doing here and the way we think about things such as ownership and our relationship to place and land. I mean, even here we have a housing crisis. So it's as simple as like individual home ownership and this like free market way that some people get homes and some people do not. Are homes wealth or are homes a fundamental human right? These are the kinds of questions that I think that the teachings, the work and the wisdom that I'm the beneficiary of from elders and folks on the land helps me navigate that unknown. Principles help me navigate some of those unknowns. I don't know what's going to happen when I'm in a space or when I'm with the people, but there's some principles that help me know as an individual what my responsibilities are to show up. So
there's a really famous and well-known story that transcends all of the indigenous cultures of the coast, which is the story of Raven bringing light into the world. And I think it really speaks to something you were talking about, Kelly. We were talking about this story. One of our people whose work has really influenced me is a man by the name of Umik, who is Nuu-chah-nulth, same group of nations that Kelly belongs to. And he's written this book called Sawak, which means oneness in Nuu-chah-nulth. In here, he tells a story that I think is relevant to like the system change work and kind of illuminates a lot of what you're saying, Kelly, right? Which is the idea of Raven stealing the light. And the essence of the story is that the light had been put into a box. The sun had been put into a box by a chief who was owning it for himself. And so the world was dark and all the animals were working to figure out how to get the sun back. And Raven is like this trickster, but also this kind of ego character. Like the Raven's like, he's a clown and a transfer, just all kind of supernatural creature, but he's got a pretty big ego on him. So a lot of the Raven stories are his failure stories. And the first couple of times they come up with plans that they're going to like go steal the sun back and for the benefit of everybody. And they try. And so like one of the stories is that they transform into a school of salmon and they're going to swim up because they're across the bay from where the chief and his village are. And they're going to swim up the river and, pop, surprise and do a special ops raid or whatever, and then grab the sun and do that kind of stuff. But of course, Raven can't get out of his bones that, okay, let's do that. But I'm going to be the biggest salmon because I have to be the biggest salmon. And so as they go, the people see the salmon coming up the stream and they see the really big salmon and all the little ones. And they're like, oh, that's Raven, obviously, like his ego betrayed his intentions. And so that doesn't work. And then what actually ends up working, and all these stories have different takes, but the story that Umik tells is that Raven transforms himself. And he's instructed in this by the wren, right, Kelly? Which comes back to the principle of apé later, because I think the wren carries this principle of kindness. And the wren kind of coaches Raven to become a small little piece of a leaf, or sometimes it's a fir needle or a little hemlock needle. And the chief's daughter dips her cup in the water and goes to drink the water, and the leaf goes inside her, and then Raven becomes her child, and so is, you know, incubated inside her, and then is born as the grandson now of the chief. So he now belongs to the system. And so this is interesting because now he's actually in the lineage of power, right? And he had to humble himself to get there. And then he does what, you know, you guys worked with Dave Snowden before, but he looks for the evolutionary potential in the system for how to get the sun back. And so as he grows up as a young boy, he kind of like gets to know how the day box works and how the chief's, and the chief shares that knowledge with him because that's my grandson. And then at the end, the chief takes the box, lets him canoe around in the bay, put the box in his canoe and paddle around in the bay, and then he brings it back. And so there's like a little bit of trust, a little bit of trust, a little bit of trust. And finally, the boy is strong enough and he has enough trust from the chief, and he launches his attack. He steals the sun and paddles across the inlet, and they release the sun. And so now we have the sun in the world. But that's like a fantastic systems transformation story that talks to me about like the tension between ownership and relationship, and about the embeddedness that we need to, you know, you have to do the transformation. The idea that there's a duality, but there's an us and them, and we're going to win. And it's not, it's much more complex than that we're actually embedded in a set of relationships together in order to shift and change systems. And we saw that a little bit in some of your reflections too, where we were talking about power, for example. Like there's powerful people that are trying to stop us. And it's like, yeah, those people might be us, actually. If we're trying to transform systems and we see that there are people that need to be transformed in order for us to get our way, in order for the world to be better, we need those people to change, then we're actually replicating the structures of colonization. We're saying that some people are disposable if they don't change to be like us, that we have the good ideas, that all of that kind of stuff. So like, we really want to build a world that's inclusive, but some people just don't think right. You know, when we can find that in ourselves, that's kind of decolonial work that we need to do. And I feel like this Raven story really begins to introduce like a lot of the principles, because you guys are asking about, well, how do we do that? How does facilitation work? But this fundamental thing you're talking about, Kelly, between the relational as really the opposite of transactional.
Yeah, I will pick up from there because something really sparked for me in you retelling me that story that I was just with Umik, who is the author of that book. I highly recommend that up as an alternate worldview, one of ways of thinking about the world. But one thing that struck me in your retelling of that story is that in order for Raven to transform and be born as, he had to be born as the chief's grandson. So he also had to be the recipient and beneficiary of love in order to create that transformation. And I think that's really important. I think when I talk about relational pieces, I think people think of love as this very fuzzy thing, but it's actually really badass and super required. We have to care deeply about each other and about our work. And I was thinking, oh my God, he was the chief's grandson. Something about that really struck me. The word for grandchild in our language is kwa-oots. Kwa-oots. The thing that's really beautiful about that is the root of that word kwa. It's in all kinds of words. Kwa, it means how we are going to be. And so embedded in just even our word for grandchild, for our future, is these little people, and how we raise them and how we love them well, and whatever work we do is how we want to be. And the other thing I wanted to share is I travel with these growing principles. And before I speak them in, I just want to acknowledge that these come from a number of teachers all up and down the coast, some of them who are no longer with us and some of them who still are. The Joe Martin carved the canoe. So this is a traditional Nuu-chah-nulth canoe. There are some of them that are very large, and we would be wayfinders from all over the Pacific, Hawaii, New Zealand, all the way up the coast to Alaska, with deep trade relationships between nations and one another. So this is a smaller, just traveler version of a hand-carved canoe. It's made of a single old growth cedar log that's been steamed, and the prow of that canoe, the head of it, it's in the shape, the traditional Nuu-chah-nulth shape is a wolf. Much of our culture is shaped around the things that we learn from wolves and deep relational care. And the word for wolf is also kwayatsik, which starts with that kwa word, how we want to be. And so the wolf prow or canoes are always pointed how we want to be. We want to go the right way. And so That's part of the story there. But acknowledging our teachers, the Martin family, the late Simon Lucas here, Umik, Dr. Richard Atleo, my grandparents, Auntie Anne Robinson. I think we always want to acknowledge our teachers. Like, I haven't been the recipient of knowledge that I'm extracting and claiming as my clever ideas. I'm in fact not clever at all. What I am is a beneficiary and listener and humble learner of deep knowledge systems, which is a kind of wealth. And then it's my job, which I introduced myself in my name, to redistribute and give it away in ways that might change you, in ways that might change me. And that's all I can do. It's a flow of the economy. It's creating more flow and disrupting the hoarding of knowledge, but also the thought that it's owned in a singular way. So here are some growing principles that I think help me in my work, wherever I go, to be well together. And each time a layer of my understanding of these words and these principles continues to deepen. And so that's why they're growing. I might need to add some, I might need to take some away, but speaking in these also speaks in some teachings that are important to some things Chris and I do actively and try to live into, just like my name. The first one is na'ata. So you see that word na'ata, and it means when we arrive to a space, we listen with our whole selves. And the instruction from Levi Martin is to listen beyond intellect. That so much of our world is focused on this like deeply cognitive work. But what's true about transformation is that, and like marketing folks, you know, all those folks who are like selling us things, they know this more than anyone. You have to make people feel things to change anything. It's heart. So unless we're aligning our intellect with our heart, and then one additional layer is, you know, we get this relational field of work, that's spirit. That's spirit. And so never discount the ability when we're gathering people in emergent ways and we're working in complexity, to also work with intuition, to also work from our gut place, from our heart place, from our spirit place. And the way that's often introduced into the work that we do is like we ensure that there's space for art beyond intellect, the things that bring us beyond intellect, that make us feel something, music, song, and it exists in all cultures across the world. So na'ata, deep listening with our whole selves, embodied work and learning. Isak is the next one, just down from that. Isak is a word that means, you know, if we, in an English way, just translated it straight across in this linear way, which is not how our language operates at all. It's just kind of commonly known as respect. And that, on a fundamental level, makes sense. Let's operate with respect. But if we were going to activate it as a verb, as we should, what it means is that we observe, we appreciate, and we act accordingly. So it's very instructive about how we live with each other in respect, but also how that we live with everything that lives and breathes, our relatives on the land, the ravens that we told the story of, the trees, the ocean. And I love this word, observe, appreciate, and act accordingly, because I think that a lot of the nature of what's been harmful in systems and in the status quo is the rush to fix, you know, the rush to create interventions. We have to do something. And it's like, no, we have to move wisely. And we have to move wisely together. And so just this stop, this sacred pause of like, observe, like what's really happening here? And we talked about starting with not just purpose, but with need. Like, what is going on here? What is happening? The idea of checking in with context. Observe. Observation is a science. It's been happening for hundreds of thousands of years. Folks have been on their land and in their communities observing. And then appreciate.
This particular one coming from, you guys were talking in your reflections about how can you begin with purpose if we're just trying to see if things are emergent. And it's this tension between, we actually don't begin with purpose, we begin with observing. And again, I don't know if Dave talked about this, but we look for evolutionary potential in the system. Like the story of Raven is, what happens if we begin with purpose? You're just throwing things at the wall. So to be able to observe and then appreciate and then act accordingly, right? Which is that the observation is made sense of. We make sense of it through the appreciation. We have a purpose. We have a direction. That wolf is leading in a certain way, but we also need to pay attention to the waves, to the currents, in this case, to the way the river operates. You don't just follow the wolf because it's pointing that one way, you need to go with what the currents are. So there's a relationship between this observation and appreciation, which is a relationship between need and purpose. And the systemic work, transformational work that we do, like for me, this value of and practice of Itzhak, it's very still to begin with, and because it requires this contemplation of self and what's important to me and what's important to us, and also what's happening around us, so that we can act accordingly. And I think that's a very, we really pulled that one out of the reflections. Hey,
Yeah.
Purpose and observation are both required.
Yeah, and I think the next two are like really interrelated, of interdependence. So there's a humility to that. I think a lot of the academy and academic world has existed or hung its hat on this idea of like singular expertise. And I was kind of shy away from that notion, but I think it's because anything I know, and I introduce my teachers and acknowledging some of beneficiary, like we're just constantly beneficiaries of a system, and we get to decide, what to do with that. But I think that collaboration over competition, like we really are interdependent. Everything I do, has an impact, and being more conscious of that helps, sometimes steer that in a good way. But I'm also human, and we're going to fail forward, but there's always learning. So lots of value to that. And then the new channeled word isn't here, but it's a really important word, and it's uphay. And uphay simply means generosity and reciprocity. And it just really shifts us into, instead of what we can get, instead of what we can get or take, it's like, what can we give? What can we give and gift? It's like moving away from this idea of what, using or being transactional, and into this idea of how do we shift everything we do into a gifting economy, into a relational economy, one of friendship. And that other one, the other word just above, ichayap stuff. What if everything we did, we lifted each other up? We lifted each other up, each other's knowledge. Like everybody knows something. Everybody in a space, everybody in a room has something to give. And when we're working in the unknown, which is always, we're working in complexity, there is no more important piece than this like self-compassion, because we're always learning. We're always learning. There's no way I would talk to my 10-year-old daughter as she's learning, if she fell or she made a mistake. Like I wouldn't chastise her. I wouldn't yell at her. I wouldn't be mean to her. I would lovingly correct her. I would bring her into accountability for some of that behavior. But I would understand that she's learning, and we just don't do that for ourselves. And in so much of this work, and Chris has used the word decolonizing, I think it's often lovingly reparenting ourselves and reparenting systems. And it might be because I'm a mom that I come from that place. But I think that's a really powerful shift to thinking about the way that we, create, if everywhere we went, we were acknowledging that there's always grief present, and always healing needed. I consider all the work I do, healing work, all the work I do, every time I'm with humans, we're always in collective healing.
These principles answer some of the questions you guys were asking about facilitation tools and processes as well. Systems transformation, I think, is enabled by not a set of tools and practice. And people are constantly chasing these. It still comes from that same hunger for what's the right thing to do, right? There's like, what's the thing that's going to work? What's the most optimal? How do I know I've done the right thing? How do we know we've got the right people in the room? And that prevents us a lot of the time from kind of starting where we are and then observing and appreciating and acting accordingly. And so when we come into the principles of facilitation, it's really not about the tools, guys. It's not about, there's no perfect process. All processes need to be tailored to the work that's being done, but to develop oneself as a facilitator is to develop a set of practices. And I was likening it to becoming a musician, which I'm a musician. If you know how to play one piece of music because you learn one piece of music, you can't call yourself a musician, because just knowing how to play a piece of music on an instrument doesn't make you a musician. The act of becoming a musician is a practice. It's about a forum for expression in one's life, and creating beauty in the world and creating community. And so the principles of being a musician are very different from the principles of making music, right? And the principles of becoming a facilitator, a change agent, very different from the principles of the processes we use. So these principles are like the ones that Kelly raised up, and the same for musicians. We have to have a desire to express ourselves. We need a desire. We need to be able to appreciate and midwife beauty into the world. We need to create community. We need to listen to others, and we need to hone our technical abilities, because the more technically I can play an instrument, the more I can do all those other things. and master the mediums that we use for our expression. And so I think this, for us, the art of hosting that we talk about, which is a set of simple practices and patterns for meaningful conversation in being present, creating participation, making space for the contribution of all voices, and co-creating. That's the fourfold practice of the art of hosting. The art of hosting is not World Cafe, it's not open space, it's not circles, it's the practice of hosting and facilitating that comes from these kinds of principles. And Kelly's done a ton of work resetting these principles in New Chalmers world. I think there's just a lot of overlap in the New Chalmers worldview. But I think maybe we'll open it up for some conversation at this point, because maybe you can see that there's a thread that moves from our views of the world into the kinds of facilitation practice that we use, because convening groups of people is systems change, bringing love into the world, honoring voices, even the voices of power that are out there against us. If we're trying to build a world that's inclusive, we need to reconcile that paradox. So maybe you can see the way all of those things come through, and maybe you still have questions about all of that. What do you think, Kelly? Is there anything else you want to say, or should we hear from folks?
I think we can hear from folks, and I will trust that somehow naturally those other things that we want to say, I think had a little bit of a joy in the long view and decolonial love, but I think other things we want to say, I think will naturally come up. Trust the people. Principle.
Trust
really.
the people, always.
People are smart.
And I hope we confused you as well, by the way.
Thank you for the conversation, Chris and Kelly. We'll open up now for question and answer session. So if somebody has a question, if you feel there's something you need to ask Chris and Kelly, just type in the chat.
So there's a question from Heather in Panama.
I work on a tribal reservation in Panama, and there's just a lot of issues, cultural issues. So I work with deaf children. So the deaf is one culture as well. It's a people group. It has its own language. So I'm immersed in that culture as much as I can as an outsider. I'm also an outsider on the tribe. My husband is Panamanian, but not tribal. We've been here 10 years. So I have this system of beautiful language that's visual, that's not available to my incredibly intelligent, deaf child who is so smart. So some of the issues that I run against, I'm a former Christian missionary. So a lot of the motivations that I'm finding are kind of this behind the scenes, conversion. That's, and I have other, as I'm learning materials, how to teach from other, tribal places in Argentina and Honduras. But it's all about, yes, we want to teach these children in order to, get them how that goes. So that's an issue for me. And I do have just these incredible, I believe, high level that are not available to these children. They don't have a specific language in order to, now they kind of do now, to express their ideas and contribute to people. And the tribe looks on them in a kind of an elevated place right now, because they see me working with him and with computers. So the question, just like any thoughts of clarifying, I change kind of in the middle when I'm here, but just being on a tribal reservation of people that I adore, they're my family, and I have just so much respect. I've made a lot of mistakes, but I'm kind of in a quandary. So I guess kind of a general question, when I believe that I have something that can help the people that would not be available to them, I don't believe. With disabled, education, things like that. Is there a filter, or, how would one navigate such things, in respect? That's my question.
I can feel all the grapple in that question, to be honest. And there's a number of things that are just super triggering for me. So it's like really hard to find wisdom.
Sorry. Yeah, I can understand.
Oh yeah, no, don't be sorry at all. I mean, I think we need to talk about those things actually, because like that's what's at the root and like uncovering that. So in these lands that I'm in, I'm a third generation residential school survivor. So for those who maybe don't know, Canada had a system of creating schools to kill the Indian and the child, to assimilate, and just real quantifiable and ongoing acts of genocide here in this country, of which I can't even know all the ways that I'm an intergenerational recipient of a lot of harm. And all of that was done in the name of Christianity. So like just context for like, how is this triggering? And at the same time, in the past many years, have done work alongside. I mean, and this is the thing that I think Chris and I have been really talking about too, is have done work alongside the Canadian United Church, who ran those schools, who ran the school that my grandfather went to. And fundamentally, they were operating under some pretty harmful biases and beliefs historically. But what I knew when I talked and met with some of the people is that at an individual level, there are lots of good people who wanted to do a lot of good work and wanted to make change. And so it's like being able to separate the systems issues from the individual pieces as well. Because some of this work is done one person and one heart at a time. Would everybody in my family or community be ready to work with the organizations that are absolutely complicit in the destruction of our culture and our family? Like, no, no, but was I? Sometimes, some days, yes, and some days, no. And so I think probably Heather has some awareness of just like that tension between the transactional nature of what the tools that she's been given mean, of like, you like, we're going to dangle this carrot, like you can get this knowledge or these tools if you also convert to Christianity. And so I think like part of your grapple, Heather, is like, that's kind of not okay, and so there's a tension there for you. And I always come to these things with probably always more questions than none of us really have good answers, but we can ask ourselves really good questions based on our sense of responsibility. So yeah, you're not responsible for all Christians. I'm not responsible for every new channel or Indigenous person in the world. It gets really dangerous. Like that's the slippery slope, is when we start to like lump people into these big lumps. But each of us as an individual has a responsibility for what we put in the world. And rather than focus on others, where I find that I can find some good power, the good kind of power, is when I can focus on my own interactions and whatever influence or kindness that I can bring to that. I feel like that's how we change systems, and that's how we can live into, what we want it to be. And so with these particular children or communities, I don't necessarily come at it with answers, but some questions based on maybe some of the things that we do here. I don't know, when you talked about intelligences and languages, I thought about all the other languages that are available as well, beyond words or even technology. It's like you also have the language of food and shared culture. That's a deep language, right? So it's just like, how do you shift towards making visible and valuing who they already are? Like, what are the ways that you fundamentally make it visible to yourself and everybody, all the good things and gifts and intelligences that exist in their existing tribal culture or in their existing Indigenous culture? Because I think everything in the world for Indigenous peoples is often set up in a hierarchy that makes them feel less than. And it's like a very powerful disruption to recenter their teachings, to recenter their way of doing things, because I don't even think we value it ourselves. There's an internalized racism that is embedded that I'm constantly confronting in myself, where we prioritize and put a Western lens. So it's just like questioning our own biases, like looking at it completely differently so that you're recentering who they are. It's like, just those are the kind of questions that come up. Are those like good, clear answers? No, but those are like the initial thoughts and I think if you have a problematic place or tools to teach with, then that is an invitation to make new tools with them in the lead. To me, it's just like, you don't want to use these tools. So what's the problem? Put those children in the lead, put their culture in the lead, and develop something alongside them. And like, there's so much opportunity there. Within destruction and chaos, I think is actually an invitation for creativity, and creativity led by the genius of your child or these children. And I'll pass it to Chris to see if he has anything smart to add.
Thank you, Kelly. I just think leave more community than you found to me, serves me quite well. And what you're just saying at the end there, like we actually did a meeting with Indigenous deaf kids last month, which was sort of really interesting, and talking about like an Indigenous model of care. And the meeting was very not strategic. It was not the strategic planning meeting that the experts wanted and everything else, but we wove together 3 families and their workers in a way that they're never going to forget the experience. And we didn't do anything really other than provide an opportunity for them to be together and to connect and talk about what was important. But strengthening the capacity of them to be a community together is really what's important. I'm a practicing Christian, and I completely condemn that practice. I don't even find Christ. That's not a Christian practice. I know what they're trying to do. They're in a world domination strategy, and they're committing genocide. I'm just going to say it. It's absolutely in line with the way Christians have occupied this continent. And I could just fully condemn it. It makes me angry and furious. But the response to that is to do what I can to leave more community that I found. And if colonization is about destroying relationships and disconnecting people from their land and their culture and their dignity as human beings, that's what colonization is. This ticks all the boxes for that. So the antidote to that is, what are the tools? Yeah, I love that. What are the tools that we could create together that these kids could actually form a community? These kids, why do we think that these children are incapable? They're just deaf. They're not incapable of making change. They're just deaf. That's all it is, So like, they're going to grow up and be with each other, and all they need is each other. That's all they need. And then that's the way that we just find our way, because that activates those principles Kelly's talking about earlier of reciprocity and gifting. When the gifting happens, it creates a cycle that feeds together more community. And when we don't know what to do, the answer is community, always. And I think this just points to the nonlinear nature of systems change. Like, we think we're making progress, and then a whole bunch of genociders come in and ruin it for us, right? And so we have to start again. And that's just the nature of it. So we need to be constantly observing, appreciating, and then acting accordingly. So I don't know if that's smart, but that's what I have to say.
The comment you made, but leave more community than you find it, it occurred to me, translated into a slightly different language, this could be the new way we talk about business.
Yeah.
Not just community, but community as a metaphor for everything. Economic health, community health, natural health, and so on. And that could, and then we can take your indigenous wisdom that you've so beautifully mentioned, and take learnings from that and build out an entire framework of how business can use community as a metaphor to leave more community.
Well, yeah. And I would say you don't need to take or probably develop anything new. Probably already exists. I think what the shift is, it's a matter of recentering existing Indigenous knowledges. There's already frameworks. They're already there. I've offered you probably pretty complete ones in lots of ways. It's just lifting things that already exist back up and recentering them. But I don't disagree. I mean, I think that's kind of the intent is, I think the transformation or the evolution is the pivot away from the transactional nature that we've seen is really creating a lot of unwellness for folks. There are some places where like being transactional probably makes a lot of sense, but the way we apply it, it isn't creating more wellness in the world. But yeah.
That part of the narrative that is about people in power who are not willing to talk to us or things like that part that you referred to in the beginning, that was coming from some of us who are currently in Russia. When we talk about dealing with intergenerational trauma and doing, the difficult work in the state when there is generally some space to stay together without killing each other. This space is different from when your country is currently committing war of aggression and war crimes. And within the country, there is conscious and very active effort to disenfranchise people, to break connections, to basically do what you refer to as colonialism, but internally just anybody who is trying to build community that's deliberately broken. We had teachers in TLST sessions from Russia, Alyona and Anastasia, who came and talked about conceptual void that they felt as systems change practitioners in that context, because they didn't know what was relevant in this situation. All these tools or all these concepts or principles of building community felt kind of inadequate to the context of power over that is currently creating absolutely unacceptable results. And the question is, do you see the conceptual difference between these two types of spaces, or do you think it's an illusion and it's still the same principles apply? It's just our emotional reaction. So the way we see it needs to change, and we need to be able to navigate this space differently, but the space is relatively the same and based on the same principles. I hope it makes sense.
I have a couple of thoughts about that, but offered with zero context for what you're talking about, Fyodor. Like, I understand that the rawness of it and how people are feeling is not what I'm experiencing at the moment. So it's easy for me to say. But I think here's the thing, like, did Dave talk about Cynefin? I mean, you must have talked about the Cynefin framework when Dave Snowden was here. And so you'll know that there's a difference between the complex systems and the chaotic systems in terms of what our responses are. And in moments of chaos, there seems to be no discernible constraints in the system. And so in order to reestablish some level of order, you need to impose constraints on the system. Now, a state will do that with boundaries, because states have asked, I talk about different constraints in the system being connection in this order: connections, so between people, exchanges, what we can trade across those connections like we're doing right now. Attractors, which can catalyze new patterns of behavior, and boundaries, which can prevent things from happening, separate things, right? The more power you have, the higher you can kind of go in that list in general. And you can be really brutal with the boundaries that you impose between people. So, of course, in the context of warfare and active genocide, a state is going to want to create, destroy connections between people, because that's the way in which state power is eroded, and create boundaries upon, which you can do this and you can't do that. Very, very tight. On the response to that also needs to be to create very tight constraints. And those are very close constraints of connection. So you see that, I think, in wartime, in warfare, in active moments of crisis, people lock together very tightly. You have to be together very tightly. A tight connection between people doesn't necessarily generate community. Community is an emergent property of different constraints at play, and it needs to be a bit looser than that. So if I'm handcuffed to you, it's unlikely we're going to generate community, right? But I might need to be handcuffed to you for my own safety, for our own safety. We might need to be that tightly together, back to back, fighting, whatever it is. And I need to trust you completely in the moment of combat. When I've worked with people who've been in combat, and that level and bond and connection is super, super strong. And so what I would say is that it actually is the same approach. Like, humans need to be together. It's just that we come together in different ways because of the intensity of the moment or the type of system that we're in. And if we're in chaos, the chaos of whether it's generated chaos or just ontological chaos, everything's falling apart around us, that the thing we need to do is find some level of connection that brings us to safety. And the last thing you would do is flee from connection to others that can help. To be on your own in such a situation is dangerous, right? It's fatal. The people that want to kill you will pick you off, or you will just not have the ability to gather the resources you need to sustain yourself. So you have to be together with people. And it sounds Pollyannish to say, oh, create community. I'm just saying create connections. Even I've worked with prisoners who've been in solitary confinement in the United States, in the cruelest forms of imprisonment. And even there, they create connections. They can discern in the moment in which the food comes through their door. And I'm talking solitary confinement for 15 years. The moment their food comes in the door, they can tell which prison guard it is. And they might exchange a word, and that gives them enough to live on. It's that connection gives them enough to live on. Does it create community? It doesn't create community, but it creates that connection. All of us have the ability to create connections, even in the most dire situations. And in chaotic situations, we need those connections to be tight, and we need those exchanges to be 100% trustworthy, because our survival depends on it. And then once things have opened up, things have slowed down, things have stopped, those connections can loosen, but they become the basis for the emergence of new community. I just believe that. And it's very abstract and intellectual, and I would hate to be preaching to people that are currently defending their lives with this, but this is what I observe, and this is what resistance looks like. This is why Kelly is alive, right? This is what her third generation ancestors did in residential schools to defeat the genocide. We call it an act of genocide. People in Canada will say, oh, how can it be an act of genocide if there's still Indigenous people around? It's like, that's a misunderstanding of genocide, right? It's an act of genocide because people resisted to it. But the intention was, as Kelly said, that river would not be able to stand on the beach. And that's just not true. That's what's happening. River is standing on her beach. And it's because of those connections over time. And then when the power accrues into those connections, it becomes possible to build from there. And that's why Anne and Umik are now helping to create laws that will protect the continuity of those cultures and those nations in the next 100 years, 200 years. So I think that's it's a question of the intensity of the experience, hey, and how tight or how loose you are. But I don't think there's never a place for connection. I think that's always the thing we can do.
To jump off a specific example of what Chris talked about is I think, first of all, wanting to acknowledge and honor the very, very valid reality of danger and death in spaces of war and deep active genocide and oppression that are taking place all over our world and all over our planet. The way that this has looked and played out in my life and within living memory is, so Indigenous peoples, New Channel peoples here in Port in my lands weren't able to vote until the 1960s. And they were not able to hire lawyers to defend or organize at all. So they couldn't organize to resist without being imprisoned and arrested, also into the 1960s. And that active legislation called the Indian Act still exists. We're still, as a people, managed by the same. There's just certain parts of it that have been lifted, like the potlatch ban. So we can organize and assemble, and we can hire lawyers, like certain parts of that. But so it's kind of insidious in the way that like active genocide within our law still absolutely exists here in Canada. Like, make no mistake about that. But at its strongest, during when residential schools were operating, people were arrested for all kinds of reasons. And when that active and like very violent oppression was taking place, it's still within living memory. It's not like super long ago. And what people did in these times of active destruction of our culture, because they weren't allowed to sing their songs anymore. It was like against the law to gather. So they hid. They still spoke the language, even though it was punished. They still sang the songs, even though they were actively being arrested. It's just that they made it small. So their interactions got very small, and they did things quietly. And so I think no matter what I learned from some of that and what that looked like was when people would assemble to talk about their sovereignty and legal rights, someone would look out, make sure an Indian agent or a police officer wasn't coming. And if they did see someone arrive, they would start singing Christian songs instead of their own songs. They did things covertly. We have these big things on our longhouses, big designs that talk about our chiefs' ownerships and like really important cultural and governance things. And instead of being on the back of longhouses that were burned down, they just remade them on canvas so that they could be put up. And then if an Indian agent or a police officer or a government agent came, they'd get taken down and folded up very small. And they'd, sing Onward Christian Soldier and not get caught. And so I think this just like kind of takes what Chris says, just like applies it to a bit of a story that's been shared with me. And like it continued, it got quiet. The interactions were made smaller, but all along the way, people never stopped planting seeds. People never stopped speaking the language. Some people did. Some people had to. Like, everyone has a different threshold for what they're willing to do to keep each other safe. And I don't blame anyone for whatever that looks like for them. Some of that looks like assimilating. For my grandfather, it did. He never spoke the language in my lifetime. He never went to potlatches or ceremonies after his residential school experience. It doesn't make him a bad person. It's just that's his survival mechanism. We all survive differently. So also honoring that part of complexity. But all along the way, people planted seeds so that people like me in safer times were able to pick it up and continue to nurture them. And what the time scale of that looks like will be different. What the seeds are might be different, and different things are planted in different people, which is why we need diversity in our gatherings. So different new channel people, different language learners, different cultural learners, when we come together, we come to wholeness. Everyone has a different part of the system. Everyone has a different part of the teaching. And so we have to listen to each other. We have to not say, oh, I'm right, you're wrong. It's like, oh, we each have a piece of the system. And when we come together and we listen to each other, we can achieve wholeness. And that's really the goal. That's really the thing. And it's like in these times of active destruction, people shared stories, which are strategies, which are values hidden in that. People retain their humanity by that generosity. I think those are the seeds too, is retained story. What are we learning? What did I learn from what people did a few generations ago? And retaining humanity through generosity, like helping each other survive. I think those are the only things we can do in those times. And because I know those stories, I can see still the way, the insidious ways those oppressive systems are still operating. So I still know there's work to do. I still have my instructions about what I need to do in this generation. Is everyone taking up the work? No. Are people doing things in a lot of different ways? Totally. And we need that. We need it all. So that's my picking up point around all of that and acknowledging. And I think that everyone doing the different thing they need to survive, like that's the acknowledgement too of intergenerational trauma of there's no one way. There's no one way to get through this. There's no one way to be human. There's no one way to be human in the face of deep inhumanity, especially. So lots of grace. The principle of grace and self-compassion becomes super important there. Yeah, that would be my addition to the thinking.
Yeah, thank you so much. So now it is time for closing remarks. But first of all, we thank you, Chris and Kelly, for the wonderful conversation you have had and what you have heard from you. So now, under closing remarks, what will you like to leave us with?
What are you talking about there, Kelly? A process and a practice?
Well, I think like process is what we're in, but practice is like what we continuously bring. It's like that consistency and that like disciplined, those are values-based way of being and work. And that's not like easeful. I talked about the badassery of love. It's like, well, if we really care about collective liberation and everybody getting free, that's not easy work. It's like all these things that sound very nice and sound very good in actual practice can be incredibly difficult. Notions of equity, because one, it means that we have to release sometimes with a lot of humility, like that story about Raven making himself a small bit to get into the system. It's not always leading from the front. It's not that kind of leadership. Can I show 2 photos and talk about them, Chris? Yeah.
Go. Yeah, please.
Okay. So this one is as 2 elders that I was just working with last week. And I wanted to show it around engaging voices. How do we engage voices in big hall work? And so these elders were a part of a dialogue that's just around fundamentally changing federal, like the entire country. It's managed. So this coast is managed out of an office in Ottawa, which is like all the way across a very large country. So it makes zero sense in a lot of ways. So all of the policy decisions that impact these people and their access to traditional foods and medicines on the coastline are made in a big, huge building by a lot of non-Indigenous people who have no idea what this coast is like or the history or the context. They have no idea. And so a very small group of folks are coming together to do that kind of what you were calling big hall work, I think. And how did we include them? And I wanted to show, it's like what you're seeing is two hereditary chiefs. So Christine Cox On the left is the hereditary chief of Cayucit-Chequasit, and Dr. Richard Atleo is the book. He's also the author of the book that's posted, both coastal hereditary leaders and both full of wisdom of a lifetime of being beneficiaries of deep ceremony and teachings. They're involved at the outset of these gatherings and meetings in core planning teams and steering committees. So how did we involve their voices in ways that center their needs and their voices? Nothing was planned without them. They led the folks from universities who made this gathering. So the academy hosted this gathering in so many ways, which as much as Christianity, that is problematic, I would say. As much as Christianity, that's the ship that continues to steer a lot of colonial harm. The people who had the institutional power, a woman named Anne Solomon, she determined and consciously is using that power in ways that give the resources and the power and recenter these people. What do you want to do? How do you want this gathering to look? What do you need? And so the entire gathering of 3 days of these two elders, who are obviously having a very nice conversation outside, it dismantles the system by giving up. Anne gives up her power, her agency, and her money so that these folks can be given space so that their voices are centered. And then she then uses her power again, because she has all kinds of letters behind her name, to bring back the legislative suggestions and to do that advocacy work to shift the way that resources are being managed. And also researchers, so using other kind of researchers and modeling and all kinds of fancy things that are the language of that oppressive system. So she's infiltrated, she's made herself small. But there's one other part of this that I wanted to talk about, is that Anne this little gathering is a couch that we moved out of her little room on campus. She went out before the gathering and caught fish so that she could barbecue them. So she packed her little Westphalia van full of little barbecues, like hibachi charcoal barbecues, and caught fish and brought it to the gathering. And she cooked a large group of elders dinner of their traditional foods that she knew that they would love and would feed their hearts and their souls. And after a whole day of meeting and her, all the planning that led up to it, she made salads and cooked and we served them. And that was really the work. We met and we talked about big policy change and that big stuff. But when I think about what the work actually was and the space we're considering, it was this. It was this photo where these elders are so happy because they're getting crispy salmon skin that was barbecued for them. And then Dr. Atleo, who's an elder, was really cold one day. And he said it's because he didn't get fish for breakfast. And you know what she did? She got up early the next morning and cooked more fish so that Dr. Atleo had what he needed the next morning. And I just thought, that lady has it right. This lady who has so much institutional power, she's made herself small. She's humbled herself in this servant leadership. And when you ask me, how do we engage the voices of grassroots people? She invited them to something they cared enough about, but then she cared for them the entire time. That's part of the how for me. And look at them. They're just it's just beautiful. And they're sharing stories and commonalities and things that they love, and they're speaking in their language. And so she just created a space for them to speak to each other in ways that they don't get to very often. And she fed them really well. And I thought that was a really beautiful thing to show. And then I just have one more photo to share. So this is a rocky beach. I was just out in the Pacific Rim National Park off my territory. So this is off-grid, water only. These are the traditional spaces of the village of the people I come from. We lived out in the islands on the ocean. And so I went camping on the island that my grandfather was born on before he was taken to residential school. And this was a big village site. And I just wanted to show it because around a context and assumptions, what you see when people look at this is they see wilderness, right? Nod. I see nature. And you'd be wrong. You're wrong. Because there's nothing wild about it. There's zero wild. I just come from a people who lived so in interconnection with this landscape that we didn't leave a mark. Well, we left actually a lot of marks, but to the untrained eye, what people revel in, when they come to these lands is this notion of wilderness that is a bias that is completely untrue, because what you don't see is really deep stewardship and deep innovation and technology that took place on this land for 15,000 years. The archaeo record, they just had another archaeological dig while we were there, takes it back to 15,000 years. Every single part of what's behind this picture of the forest is berry bushes that have been stewarded for abundance. Our medicines, there's wild yarrow, you see in front of you, sea asparagus. Every single part of this landscape has been touched in a way that not only benefits the people to live and eat and receive medicine, but also benefits the landscape itself so that more can grow. So when we're talking about leave more community, they left more community, but also with the natural world. And so this little on the right of the picture coming in, there's a number of those, and it's low tide right now, but when the tide comes up a little bit, like what it is there's actually stewarded sanded paths that you could bring canoes up on. The like change to the landscape was to create more space and more gathering and easier access for people. So there's a story to everywhere we go, and there's a deeper context to everyone we meet. And we can't just arrive to those things taking things at face value. And that's the purpose of checking in, about being able to get to the truth of our unquestioned biases about place, such as the notion of wilderness itself being fundamentally untrue. It's a very romantic and can be a really harmful bias, because it lets us think that these lands were unoccupied when they're actually deeply stewarded, deeply cared about, and deeply occupied. And so how is it that we create gatherings where we shift towards making visible, making visible what we can't often see, or making visible at worst what's been deliberately erased? So I spent time on this land last week with my littlest kiddo. And the other thing I thought about, because she got to the beach and ran. She got to this beach and she ran. And you know what she did? She fell and she hurt herself really bad and got scratched up with barnacles. And that made me think too about us and us adults, and the way we do not pay attention to context. The way that we try to apply the way we want to move and the way our ego tells us to move on every single place we go. And we get humbled, and she cried a little bit, she got back up, but then she knew that she needed to walk with care and she needed to move consciously in this landscape. And it taught her. It taught her how to move through it. And then she found the canoe skids that were like sand, and then she was out in the water. But yeah, it just really sunk in for me when I looked at this land, and when I saw the way my kid interacted with it, when I just saw medicine and food everywhere I looked, just the power of what we think we see, and then sometimes what's actually there, but we only get to know it when we speak with people and we listen in and really tune into things. So those are my two photos that were additional things.
Kelly.
Yeah.
Before you take that one down, is that little gap there one of the canoe skids?
Yeah.
Okay, so that will be my final comment, just to leave that up. Because when we were talking about this, Kelly was telling me this story, and you can see how the beach is very rocky, but there's a little cleared area there. And that's a canoe skid, which means it's a place that somebody cleared hundreds and hundreds of years ago in order to make it easy to get to the water. So when River discovered that, then she didn't have to fall on the barnacles. But also, when we were talking before, Kelly was like, yeah, I was really appreciative of my ancestors for leading that canoe skid for us. And when I thought about it, I thought we revere ancestors like that picture of Anne and Umik, like as if they're old people. But the ancestor that created this canoe skid might have been 17, right? Because who's going to lift up big rocks and move them to the side? Like, it's not going to be Umik anymore. That's for sure. He's going to get his grandkid to go do it. And so the 17-year-old that cleared that canoe skid so that River can have access to the sea. When we express appreciation for our ancestors, we tend to revere them as if they are, the ones who knew so much more and who did so many significant things. But actually, we're all the ancestors, the people that will come after us. And the work that we do to clear the little pathways so that our children have access to the sea, so that we have an appreciation of the state in which the world is, that we can move safely and securely and abundantly in it. That's, I think, what we're all trying to do. And that's definitely what I'm trying to do, and why I work with folks like Kelly in my life because it helps me be a better ancestor. So systems transformation, it's not going to happen in our lifetimes, but we maybe take the long view and be better ancestors.
And like River, remember to play, enjoy. Right. So, I mean, I guess the last significant part of this photo is there's a child there that probably wasn't supposed to exist. Who was I? You know, there's something really poetic and beautiful about that. Canada has systemically worked to destroy a people. And here we are, and I introduced myself in my language, and I shouldn't have been able to do that. And so every day that we exist is a miracle. This child and her standing in the place where her grandfather was born and speaking the language with, you know, our peers and our family and our hereditary chiefs, like in this land that wasn't supposed to be here in 2022, but it is. It's not because of big heroic things that happen. It happened because out of necessity, because people needed to survive. People did the work, not because they were paid or whatever, but people show up a lot of time in the grassroots space, not because it's joyful and they love it. It's because their very survival depends on it. It's very privileged to think that people do things because they want to. That was another thing that occurred to me. And this little person, this River Saakis is her traditional name. You know, she just doesn't feel dispossessed in any way. Like absolutely an autonomous being.
Thank you so much.